Imagine lying alone in a bed stuffed with straw, the wind howling through the cracks of your wooden walls, and your only companion is a flea-infested blanket. This isn't the beginning of a tragic romance novel. It's the nightly reality of a medieval peasant. Let's get one thing straight. If you thought modern dating was difficult, try being a poor farmhand in 14th century Europe, whose only dating app was whatever person happened to be within shouting distance at the village well. In truth, the concept of dating as we know it simply didn't exist. It wasn't about swipe rights, love letters, or first dates at a candlelit tavern. It was about survival, family pressure, and an ever-watchful church. Most medieval peasants lived in small villages of fewer than 300 people. That means the pool of potential romantic partners was limited, to say the least. Imagine if Tinder only showed you your 2 cousins and a married blacksmith. Now imagine that one of them had 3 teeth and the other had never bathed in winter. That was your entire romantic reality. For young men and women, romance wasn't a matter of hearts and poetry. It was about livestock and labor. If your father wanted to marry you off, he didn't ask if you were in love. He asked how many chickens the other family would throw in. Girls were often considered ready for marriage by the age of 12 or 13. Boys, slightly later, usually around 14 to 16, depending on when they could actually carry a haystack without passing out. That's not because anyone thought teenagers were emotionally mature. It's because the average life expectancy was around 35. And waiting until you were ready emotionally might mean dying alone. And yet, despite all these limitations, there was still longing. Still shy glances exchanged while walking past the communal oven. Still clumsy attempts to speak a word or two without stuttering. Because human nature doesn't vanish in hardship. It finds quiet, persistent ways to live. Take the village festival, for instance. These rare events were more than just opportunities to feast. They were one of the few sanctioned times young people could actually interact without drawing suspicion. Under the pretext of dancing or helping string up banners, many awkward flirtations took place. If a boy offered a girl a ribbon or a sprig of rosemary, it could mean something more. A silent gesture with loud intention. Still, many peasants didn't even marry for affection. Arranged marriages were common, often decided by families long before the children had any say. Fathers would shake hands at the market, and that would be that. Your destiny sealed somewhere between the pigsty and a sack of barley. And what if you happened to be gay in medieval Europe? Let's just say it wasn't a time for rainbow flags. Any deviation from strict heterosexual norms wasn't just frowned upon. It could get you excommunicated or worse. So for many, love lived quietly in secret in glances and unspoken bonds that dared not rise to the surface. Now let's talk about the role of class. Because not only were peasants expected to marry early and quietly, they were expected to marry within their station. Falling for someone of noble blood? That wasn't just scandalous. It was dangerous. A peasant girl caught with a knight's son might face social exile, or worse, be accused of witchcraft for seducing a man of higher standing. So what did love look like in this reality? It was muddy boots and calloused hands, a small loaf of bread saved from your meal to offer someone you fancied. It was a stolen moment near the barn before the rooster crowed, or a whispered greeting on the walk to morning mass. It was choosing to share your meager blanket with someone during the harvest season. In some villages, there were strange customs that served as makeshift courtship. For example, bundling, a practice where a boy and girl were allowed to sleep in the same bed, fully clothed, with a board between them. The logic? Proximity without risk. The reality. Let's just say a wooden board was not much of a barrier to curious teenagers. Some scholars say this practice was even encouraged in certain Protestant communities as a way to test affection without allowing premarital intimacy. Unsurprisingly, it often led to the very thing it was supposed to prevent. Peasants didn't write sonnets or serenade beneath balconies. Most couldn't even read, let alone compose poetry. But love still found expression in labor, in loyalty, in the quiet promise to share burdens. A man might spend the day chopping wood, not just for his family, but also for the girl he hoped to marry. A woman might leave a scrap of fabric near a man's tools, subtly marked with a symbol only he would recognize. It was primitive, yes, but it was also deeply human. Still, for every story of quiet devotion, there were tales of crushing disappointment. Many peasants were forced into unions with people they didn't like because of debt, land rights, or simply obedience. Love, if it came at all, often came after the vows, or never. Imagine living your life tied to someone chosen not for compatibility, but convenience. And imagine trying to nurture affection in a world where you were both exhausted, cold, hungry, and constantly under the weight of obligation. That's not the start of a fairy tale. It's the start of nearly every medieval marriage. And yet, people found joy. A smile after a long day. A moment shared under the moon. A joke whispered during planning season. These were the building blocks of medieval intimacy. Not grand gestures, but tiny flickers of warmth in a cold, structured world. Picture this. A boy of 16, hands cracked from the winter's frost, sneaks a glance at the miller's daughter while she hangs laundry in the biting wind. Her cheeks are red, not from blush, but from the cold. And yet, for a brief second, the world softens. He doesn't say a word. He can't. He's never spoken to her beyond a mumbled evening. But in his mind, he's already imagined what it would be like to walk beside her at the spring festival. This was how many love stories began in medieval villages. In silence. Words were a luxury, and risk even more so. A misplaced compliment could lead to gossip. A look held too long might be noticed by a chaperoning aunt. And heaven forbid her father saw you near the fence. You'd be lucky to walk away with your dignity, let alone your jaw. But still, there were ways. One such tradition was the Maypole Festival, an event held in many European villages around May Day. Here, young people danced in circles, weaving ribbons and glances alike. It was one of the few times when men and women could mingle with some freedom. If a boy chose to partner with a girl for the dance, it was seen as a sign, sometimes serious, sometimes playful. But it allowed interaction, and that was rare enough to treasure. Then there were the love tokens. Small, handmade objects given discreetly. A ribbon, a brooch, a small wooden carving. These items carried immense weight. A girl who accepted one was effectively acknowledging interest. A girl who returned it. Well, heartbreak existed long before Taylor Swift. Some communities had peculiar customs. In parts of Wales, a suitor might carve a spoon from a single piece of wood, intricately decorated with symbols of loyalty and protection. If the girl accepted the spoon, a courtship began. If she didn't, the spoon might end up stirring her mother's stew instead. In Germany, a boy might serenade beneath the girl's window. But remember, this wasn't Venice. There were no gondolas or balconies. It was more likely that he'd be standing in the mud outside a timber-framed cottage, hoping the family pig wouldn't squeal and wake the whole household. Despite the grime, despite the rules, young people still found each other. There are parish records that tell of couples marrying after meeting at market days or even while waiting in line at the communal oven. Romance, while rare, was possible, but often improvised around daily life. Let's say you were one of the lucky ones. You'd met someone. There was mutual interest. Maybe a parent wasn't entirely opposed. What now? There was still the matter of permission. Not from the girl, but from her father, the priest, and sometimes the local lord. In some cases, a lord had the right to approve or deny peasant marriages on his land, since their children would become his serfs too. If he didn't like the match or felt it might weaken labor productivity, he could block it. And if a couple tried to marry in secret, they could be fined or excommunicated. The church maintained strict control over marriage rituals, often requiring bans to be read aloud in church for 3 consecutive Sundays to allow objections. It wasn't just bureaucracy. It was surveillance in the name of sanctity. And yet, couples still eloped. Sometimes they would flee to another village, marry in secret, and return only when the deed was done. Some were forgiven, some were not. But in every generation, there were those willing to risk social ruin for love. Romeo and Juliet weren't unique. They were just better remembered. Of course, not all was as romantic. There were those who married for need, not want. A widow with 2 children might accept a suitor simply because he had grain. A man might marry a woman for access to her family's land or livestock. Love, if it bloomed, bloomed slowly, like a stubborn winter thaw. And for many, it never bloomed at all. A young man might spend his days gazing at the baker's daughter and yet marry the carpenter's niece out of duty. A woman might harbor feelings for her cousin's husband for years, never uttering a word. Unrequited love was common and expected. Then came the heartbreaks no one spoke about. What happened when the boy you liked married someone else? You still saw him every day, at church, in the fields, at festivals. What happened when the girl you danced with last spring now carried another man's child? There were no diaries to confide in, no breakup playlists, just the long quiet of chores and the ache of what-ifs. It's easy to romanticize the past, to picture peasants falling in love among wheat fields, hands brushing under the sun. And yes, those moments may have happened. But more often, love was a quiet endurance, a hope that maybe, just maybe, someone might choose you not for land, not for livestock, but for the way you smiled when you handed them a slice of brown bread. There were rare exceptions, of course. Stories that made their way into folk songs of a girl who defied her father and ran off with a farmhand, or a boy who worked for years to earn a dowry and finally won his love. But those tales stood out precisely because they were unusual. In most cases, the lonely peasant dilemma wasn't solved by love. It was solved by settling, by marrying someone tolerable, living a shared life of work and obligation, and hoping that someday affection would follow. And in the quiet moments, when the fields were still and the hearth burned low, maybe, just maybe, they reached across the bed stuffed with straw, took a calloused hand, and felt something warm flicker inside them. Not a fairy tale, not fireworks, but something real. And in the medieval world, that was more than most dared hope for. Forget flowers, sweet words, and passionate declarations. In the medieval world, love wasn't something you fell into. It was something you paid for. To marry was not a matter of the heart, It was a matter of contract, cows, and calculations. If you were lucky, affection might come later. But first, you had to meet the expectations of everyone else. Your family, your priest, your community, and your landlord. Let's start with the basis math of medieval matchmaking. If you were a man seeking a wife, your worth wasn't measured by charm or looks. It was measured in land, livestock, or tools. Could you plow? Could you protect? Could you provide? If so, you were a contender. If not, you were a bachelor, possibly for life. And if you were a woman, your value was equally transactional. The questions weren't about your wit or dreams. They were, how many blankets came in your dowry? Could you spin? How many healthy children could you bear? Would your marriage secure a useful alliance for your family? You weren't marrying a person, you were negotiating a merger. In villages across medieval Europe, the custom of dowries and bride prices defined the structure of marriage. A dowry was wealth transferred from the bride's family to the groom, a kind of payment to sweeten the deal. It might include land, grain, livestock, or household goods. In poorer families, the dowry could be as simple as a goat and a spinning wheel. In richer ones, entire fields might change hands. On the other hand, a bride price, or mourning gift in some cultures, was the reverse. Money or goods the groom's family gave to the bride's family. Sometimes as proof that he could support her, sometimes as compensation for the loss of a working daughter. Either way, love came with a receipt. These arrangements weren't necessarily cruel. They were practical. Life was hard. Resources were limited. A marriage was often the only way to survive, to combine labor and property, to form strategic alliances even among peasants. And these negotiations were taken very seriously. Families would meet over weeks or months to decide terms. Priests might act as witnesses. Village elders might give opinions. Occasionally, disputes would arise over how many chickens were promised or whether a sack of grain was included in the deal. Some of these ended in shouting matches. Others ended in lawsuits. Once terms were agreed upon, the couple might be allowed to spend some time together, but always supervised. They might exchange small gifts. They might speak briefly at church or in the field, but nothing was left to chance. The marriage was already a deal. Feelings were optional, and for many women especially, this meant no choice at all. A girl might be promised to a man 20 years her senior because he had land, or to a widower with 3 children because he needed help raising them. Her father made the decision. Her mother reinforced it. The priest blessed it. Her opinion was rarely asked. And yet, some resisted. There are records, usually buried deep in ecclesiastical archives, of girls refusing to marry a chosen man. Sometimes they would run to a convent and claim sanctuary. Sometimes they would claim a vow of celibacy, forcing the church to step in. In rare cases, the local lord would mediate, especially if the dispute disrupted the village. But these women were exceptions. Most complied. Not out of obedience or even fear, but because they had no other viable path. And what of love in these arrangements? Did it ever come? Surprisingly, yes. There are letters from the later medieval period, written by literate peasants, clergy, and merchants, that show genuine affection developing between couples after marriage. They speak of missing one another, of small kindnesses, of shared sorrow and joy. Love didn't lead to marriage, but sometimes marriage grew into love. Still, many marriages remained cold and functional. Husbands and wives performed their roles, raised children, and shared beds, but not hearts. They were economic partners, not soulmates. And the rules were strict. Adultery, especially by women, was treated harshly. A woman caught cheating could face public shaming, whipping, or even death, depending on the region and social class. Men, while given more leeway, could still be punished, especially if they seduced another man's wife. Why so harsh? Because marriage wasn't just about individuals. It was about property, inheritance, and bloodlines. A child born of infidelity could complicate inheritance. A broken marriage could break alliances. In short, love wasn't just personal, it was political. And the church made sure everyone remembered that. Marriage was one of the 7 sacraments, sanctified by God and governed by doctrine. Priests ensured that couples followed the correct rituals. Bans, public announcements of intent to marry, had to be read 3 times before the ceremony. Weddings had to be witnessed. Consent had to be spoken aloud. But here's the twist. The church also insisted that marriage required the free will of both parties. So even in an arranged union, the bride and groom had to say, "I do." If either party refused, the marriage could be deemed invalid. Of course, refusing wasn't easy, especially when your family stood behind you with expectant eyes and a wagon full of linens. Still, the idea of mutual consent gave some agency, however small. And over time, this idea would slowly grow into modern notions of marital choice. But in the thick of medieval life, marriage remained, first and foremost, a business deal, a transaction, a strategy, a merging of farms and fates. If love bloomed, it was a welcome surprise. If not, you kept plowing, kept cooking, kept bearing children, and hoped your next life might be more romantic than this one. Let's step into a real medieval village. A cluster of wattle and daub cottages, the smell of manure in the air, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer. In this world, marriage was not something whispered about beneath the stars. It was negotiated in daylight, in the presence of pigs, priests, and property ledgers. Take, for example, the case of Matilda of Stow-on-the-Wold, a peasant girl whose father struck a deal with a local farmer. Matilda was 16, with calloused hands from years of spinning wool and little say in her own future. Her dowry? 1 milk cow, a bolt of homespun linen, and a dented copper pan. In return, her husband's family promised to give her a small corner of land to grow onions and a room in their already crowded home. Matilda didn't cry at her wedding. She didn't smile either. She stood stiffly, reciting vows she barely understood, while her father looked on, satisfied. To him, it was a fair trade. A daughter for dignity, a burden traded for a better deal. She would go on to have 6 children. Only 3 survived to adulthood. Now compare that to Isabel, daughter of a prosperous miller. Her father was wealthier than most villagers, and he expected a high price for her hand. The suitor was the son of a reeve, a local manager for the lord's estate. Their families spent months negotiating a deal. Isabel's dowry included a flock of sheep, 4 silver spoons, and a parcel of land. In exchange, the groom's family paid 20 shillings and agreed to allow Isabel to remain close to her parents' house. The wedding feast was grand, for peasants. Bread with honey, roasted fowl and ale flowed freely. Music played. Isabel even wore a garland of fresh flowers, a luxury in spring. And while no one asked if she loved her new husband, there was laughter. There was dancing. And for a moment, it felt like joy. But not every transaction ended so peacefully. In some cases, the bride price wasn't paid in full. leading to disputes that dragged on for years. There are medieval court records describing mothers suing grooms for failing to deliver the promised pigs or cloaks. These weren't petty squabbles. In a world where every possession counted, breaking a marriage agreement could be disastrous. And then there were the runaway brides. Occasionally, a woman, faced with a looming unwanted marriage, would flee. She might escape to a convent, where the nuns would shelter her under a vow of chastity. Some tried to elope with lovers, slipping away at night and hiding in neighboring villages. If caught, they risked excommunication, imprisonment, or even physical punishment. One story tells of Bridget of Lichfield, who vanished the day before her wedding. Her betrothed, a widower twice her age, had agreed to the match with her father. But Bridget had fallen in love with a journeyman carpenter. When found 3 villages away, already married in secret, the local bishop was furious. The carpenter was fined, Bridget was sent to a convent, and her father lost his standing in the guild. Love had cost them everything. Still, some resisted more subtly. Some women, rather than fleeing, would sabotage the marriage talks, burning their own dowry cloth, pretending illness, or spreading rumors about the suitor's bad humors. It was risky, but occasionally effective. In rare cases, even priests intervened to prevent what they saw as unjust unions. But for the vast majority, marriage happened according to plan. Once the contracts were sealed, the ceremony followed, usually held outside the church, on the steps or in the churchyard. The couple would exchange vows aloud, often in the local dialect, and sometimes perform symbolic acts, like joining hands or wrapping them in a strip of cloth. Witnesses were essential. Without them, the marriage might later be contested. And contested marriages were no small matter. They could mean years of legal battles, fights over inheritance, and excommunication. Speaking of inheritance, it was everything. A man with no male heir had to be careful. He might marry his daughter off to a trusted ally to ensure his land stayed within the family. Or he might stipulate in the wedding contract that the groom take his family name, a practice more common among wealthier classes, but not unheard of among ambitious peasants. And this obsession with inheritance shaped everything about love, sex, and relationships. In noble families, the consequences were even more dramatic. Entire dynasties rose and fell because of failed marriages. In royal courts, marriages were statecraft, negotiated between kingdoms, sealed with dowries the size of villages. But among peasants, the stakes were more personal. The difference between a good and bad marriage might mean eating this winter or not. So what happened after the vows? Usually, a small feast followed. Bread, ale, maybe meat if the family could afford it. Friends and neighbors gathered. Jokes were made. Songs were sung, often bawdy. In some villages, the community would lead the couple to bed, a ritual called bedding the bride, where witnesses made sure the marriage was consummated. Privacy, it seems, was not always considered romantic. And yet, once the party ended, real life began. The newlyweds settled into shared labor. They worked side by side, sowing fields, tending animals, raising children. Some grew close, some remained distant. But regardless of feelings, they were bound by survival. So yes, love in the Middle Ages was transactional. It was tied to economy, family strategy, and religious oversight. But even in those rigid structures, affection sometimes bloomed. Sometimes it came quietly, with a shared loaf of bread. Sometimes it came not at all. But the deal was struck, and for better or worse, the bargain had been sealed. There was a time when to love the wrong person could cost you your freedom or your life. In the medieval world, not all love was allowed, and the boundaries weren't just drawn by families or fortune. They were drawn by the church, the crown, and custom. You didn't have to do anything scandalous. You didn't need to write steamy poetry or get caught sneaking into someone's cottage. All it took was falling for someone who wasn't yours to love. Let's begin with the most dangerous kind of romance in the Middle Ages. Interclass love. Imagine a poor village girl falling for the second son of a nobleman. She might catch his eye while gathering firewood near the manor. He might smile, offer her a piece of fruit, maybe even speak kindly to her. That moment, small and fleeting, was already a crime of sorts. Because if that affection went further, if a nobleman took a peasant woman as a lover, no one would question his behavior. But if she dared to hope for something more, if she whispered to her friends that he might actually care for her, then suddenly she was a liar, a temptress, a witch. And if she became pregnant, the nobleman's family would deny it. The church would shame her. The village would likely ostracize her. She might be sent away to a poorhouse, or worse, die in childbirth without help. The man would go on with his life. She'd be left with the ruin of hers. This wasn't just about social cruelty. It was about order. Medieval society was built like a ladder, and everyone had a rung. To fall in love across those rungs was to shake the entire system. But class wasn't the only forbidden frontier. There were also the loves forbidden by God, or at least by those who claimed to speak for him. Clergy were expected to remain celibate. Priests, monks, friars, they took vows, and yet they were human. They lived among the people. They heard confessions from lonely women. They gave last rites to dying men's wives. They comforted, counseled, and occasionally connected. There are countless records, mostly hidden in ecclesiastical courts, of priests who fathered children, of monks who ran off with widows, of friars who broke their vows in moonlit corners. Some were punished. Others were quietly reassigned to distant parishes. But the women? They bore the shame, the child, and the consequences. One such story survives in a 14th century manuscript from Normandy. A young woman named Marguerite, who fell in love with a village priest, Father Armand. He was gentle, kind, and often brought her bread when her family went hungry. Their relationship deepened in secret. When she became pregnant, Armand begged the bishop for leniency. Instead, he was excommunicated. Marguerite was beaten by villagers and cast out. Her child was left at the church steps. Both were never seen again. It's a tragic tale, but not a rare one. The church's grip on romantic boundaries didn't stop at clergy. It extended to consanguinity, the idea that people couldn't marry within a certain number of degrees of blood relation. In some periods, this meant you couldn't marry your third cousin. In others, even more distant ties were forbidden. The logic? To prevent sin, scandal, and the concentration of land ownership. Of course, many people didn't even know who their third cousins were. Especially among peasants, these rules were often ignored or misunderstood. But if someone powerful objected, say, a lord who didn't want a rival peasant family growing stronger, he could claim the marriage was invalid and have it annulled. Another kind of forbidden love was far more dangerous. Love outside the marriage bond. Adultery, especially by women, was treated with brutal consequences. A married woman caught with another man could be whipped, imprisoned, branded, or killed. In some towns, She might be paraded through the streets with her hair shaved off, a sign of disgrace. The man, if he was unmarried, might get a fine. If he was married, he could also face serious punishment. But it was usually the woman who bore the brunt. Why so harsh? Because again, marriage wasn't just about love. It was about property and paternity. A child born to a married woman needed to be unquestionably her husband's heir. If adultery muddied that, it threatened entire lines of inheritance. Among the nobility, affairs were more common, but not less risky. A queen caught with a lover might face execution. A knight who seduced a lord's daughter could lose his lands or his life. One particularly infamous case occurred in 1314, the Tour de Nesle affair. 3 daughters-in-law of the King of France were accused of adultery, allegedly caught with 2 brothers who served as squires. The punishment was swift and merciless. The women were imprisoned for life. The men were tortured, mutilated, and executed, all because love, or lust, crossed a forbidden line. But not all forbidden love was punished. Some was simply ignored, hidden, or endured. A man might secretly love another man and never speak of it. A woman might carry a candle for someone she could never have and simply marry someone else. These loves lived in shadows, in songs, in poems, in dreams. They shaped lives without ever becoming reality. The medieval world didn't have words like gay or boshy in the way we understand them today. But same-sex attraction existed, as it always has. And though it was officially condemned by the church, it surfaced in letters, in scandalous trials, and in whispered rumors. The poet Richard de Fournival once wrote of love that is pure yet not permitted, hinting at a desire that dared not speak its form. In convents, there were stories of intense emotional bonds between nuns, bonds that sometimes strayed beyond the spiritual. But always, the rules pressed in. Always, someone was watching. Always, love had limits. Let's imagine a pair of young lovers. Elric, a village apprentice with dirt under his nails and dreams behind his eyes, and Daria, the only daughter of a wealthy merchant. Their worlds were close enough to touch, yet never meant to mix. Elric first saw her delivering fabric to the manor. She wore a veil, but her eyes were curious, unafraid. He was hammering wood into place, fixing a cracked door. She paused, asked if he needed water. That was all. But Elric would never forget her voice. Over the next year, they met only in passing. A glance across the chapel aisle, a half smile at the harvest dance. Speaking more than a few words would raise questions. But something had begun. Something dangerous. Daria's father already had plans for her. She would marry the son of a spice trader from a neighboring town. The dowries were agreed upon. The guild contracts prepared. Her marriage would bring more profit than her father's last 2 shipments combined. Elric, of course, had no dowry. He had no name. His only wealth was his skill with a chisel and his silent devotion. So they did the unthinkable. They met in secret. At night, beyond the hedgerow, under the old oak where the lanterns couldn't reach. They never kissed, never touched. But they spoke, they laughed, they dreamed. And in that, they became guilty. Because in the eyes of medieval society, intention was enough. You didn't need to lie together in the grass or whisper oaths beneath the moon. Simply wanting what you shouldn't was dangerous. And that was where so many stories of forbidden love ended. Not in fire, not in tragedy, but in quiet heartbreak. Because the world was louder, older, and far less forgiving than love ever could be. Daria was married within a month. Elric stood in the crowd as her wedding procession passed. He didn't cry, but that night he carved a rose into the beams of the church roof, where no one would ever look. It's still there, centuries later. Not all forbidden loves were so restrained. In some cases, the defiance was public. A girl might refuse an arranged marriage, insisting on marrying someone her parents disapproved of. If she fled and married in another town, the church sometimes protected her, especially if the marriage was properly witnessed and consummated. But she could never return home. The penalties for stealing a bride, even if she came willingly, could be harsh. In many regions, it was considered abduction, and the man could be jailed or executed. In extreme cases, the bride was forced into penance, kneeling outside the church for days, fasting, confessing to a sin the heart didn't recognize as wrong. And then, there were the punishments that blurred the line between law and humiliation. In 13th century Florence, for example, a woman caught committing adultery could be sentenced to walk through the town barefoot in her undergarments, clutching a fish, a symbolic punishment meant to invoke shame and mock lust. Crowds would jeer, children would throw mud. It was punishment not just of the body, but of the soul. But not all forbidden love was punished with cruelty. Sometimes it was simply erased. Many of the most tender stories never made it to the records. The servant who fell in love with the noble lady, but never said a word. The knight who watched his squire with a gaze too soft for friendship. The nun who wept at night, not for God, but for the girl she kissed once before they took their vows. These stories weren't written because they were too fragile, too dangerous, too human. Yet hints survive in the margins of medieval manuscripts. Doodles of entwined hands, poems about longing that never name their subject. The Middle Ages had no shortage of love, only shortage of permission. One of the most haunting examples comes from a letter written by a young monk named Henricus. His words were never sent. They were found in the binding of a damaged psalter centuries later. I pray for him, not because it is holy, but because it is the only way I am allowed to speak his name. What does that tell us? That even behind the strict walls of the monastery, love found root. It had no altar, it had no witness, but it existed, and it endured. So what did people do with forbidden love? Some turned it into stories, chansons, ballads, folk tales. Lovers who defied lords and leapt from cliffs, women who dressed as men to be near those they adored, men who fought duels not for honor, but for affection. Others turned it into silence. They buried it beneath duty, beneath years, beneath the names of their children. But in both cases, the love remained. In a world of rigid roles and brutal consequences, love had to become invisible, encrypted, stubborn. It had to sneak between the lines, hide behind customs, disguise itself in politeness or prayer. Not all of it was pure, not all of it was just, but all of it was real, and none of it was allowed. Imagine a world without dating apps, no profile bios, no romantic dinners, and no texting, "You up?" at midnight. In medieval Europe, if you wanted to find a spouse, you didn't scroll. You summoned a matchmaker, consulted the stars, or trusted a toothless aunt who claimed to sense chemistry in sheep. Because, as odd as it sounds, finding love in the Middle Ages required more than luck. It required rituals, signs, blessings, gossip, and sometimes even magic. Let's start with the unsung heroes of medieval romance, the local matchmakers. They weren't called matchmakers, of course. In England, they might be called go-betweens. In France, marieurs. In Germany, Heiratsvermittler. But no matter the name, their job was clear. Find suitable marriage matches, especially in small rural communities where options were slim and stakes were high. Most of them were older women, widows, or spinsters who had lived long enough to gain social authority and who had sharp memories for family trees. They remembered who was related to who had land, who had bad knees, and who could bake a barley loaf without setting the oven on fire. A matchmaker would go door to door or pull someone aside at the well, saying something like, "That blacksmith's daughter has strong arms and her own. Ox, perfect for your nephew with the lazy eye." She didn't sugarcoat. She didn't romanticize. She stated facts, and those facts were powerful. If two families agreed to begin talks, they might invite the matchmaker to mediate negotiations, discussing dowries, labor expectations, and church arrangements. Sometimes, a small fee or gift was given: a pie, a wool shawl, a jar of mead. In more urban areas, especially in Jewish and Muslim communities, professional matchmakers existed and could earn substantial fees for successful pairings. But matchmakers weren't the only ones helping Cupid. The medieval world also turned to the supernatural, especially when logic failed. Fortune-telling was surprisingly common, especially among young women desperate to know if they'd marry soon or ever. There were dozens of rituals for this. One involved peeling an apple in a single spiral and throwing the peel over your shoulder. The letter it formed on the ground? The first initial of your future spouse. Another had girls place yarrow under their pillows and chant before sleep. "Thou pretty herb of Venus's tree, thy true name tell to me." If they dreamed of a man that night, he was the one. Unless it was the blacksmith's apprentice again, in which case dreams lied. On certain nights, like All Hallows' Eve or Midsummer, the boundaries between worlds were believed to thin. These were prime times for divination. Girls would walk backwards around a church 3 times or stare into mirrors at midnight by candlelight, hoping to see a husband's face. Sometimes they just saw their own face looking terrified. Close enough. And then, there were signs from nature. A crow flying east on your birthday? Lucky in love? A sudden sneeze during Mass? A suitor is thinking of you? A cow mooing 3 times after dusk? Either rain is coming or romance. Interpretation varied widely. Of course, not all matchmaking relied on superstition. Many villages hosted seasonal festivals, especially during harvest, that were unofficially designed for mingling. Dancing, shared labor, communal baking, all these allowed young people to meet in semi-supervised ways. One particularly strange ritual from parts of medieval France involved the courting bench, a long, hard, wooden seat placed at the edge of town. On certain feast days, young men and women would be invited, forced, to sit next to one another for hours, while elders watched and commented from a distance. Awkward? Very. But sometimes love grew from it. In Germany and parts of Switzerland, spring festivals sometimes included symbolic kidnappings, where boys would steal a girl from another village and bring her back, laughing and blushing as part of the fun. It sounds chaotic now, and it was. But it served as a highly ritualized, community-accepted form of flirtation. But even when all the stars aligned, even with the approval of matchmakers, priests, cows, and the yarrow under your pillow, romance still had to pass one final test: the gossip. Because in medieval villages, nothing was secret. If you were seen walking with someone, helping them carry water, or lingering too long after Mass, people talked, and their opinions mattered. Matchmaking wasn't just about 2 people. It was about 2 families, 2 households, and the village itself. A good match pleased many, A scandalous one offended everyone. So love, when it arrived, had to wear many disguises. It came in the form of a chance encounter arranged by a cousin. It came through gifts of bread left behind at someone's door. It came as a partner in the sheep shearing contest, or a volunteer for haystack duty who mysteriously showed up every time you did. Romance was improvisational theater, with matchmakers as stage managers and fate as a frequently drunk director. And despite the odds, it worked, sometimes. Because even without apps, speed dating, or flower deliveries, medieval people found each other. Through soil and song, through ritual and rumor, through the laughter of old women who claimed to have a nose for marriages. And when they did, they held hands beneath wool cloaks. They danced once a year under torchlight. They carved names into fence posts. They fell in love in spite of everything. So far, we've explored the respectable side of medieval matchmaking. The aunties, the apple peels, the holy feast day dances. But the Middle Ages weren't all veils and virtue. When matchmaking failed, or when patience ran thin, people turned to other methods. Let's talk about love potions, charms, omens, and the very real fear of hedgehogs. Yes, really. In towns from York to Prague, love potions were part of the secret arsenal for those unlucky in love. Some were brewed by village wise women, midwives, or herbalists. Others were prepared in total secrecy, using instructions passed by whispered word. What went into these mysterious concoctions? Powdered rose petals, crushed pearls, if you were wealthy, honey, nettle, and elderflower. In less romantic cases, dried toad skin or bat's blood. Most of these weren't magical. Some were dangerously toxic. But they were often administered with food or wine, given innocently to the target. The idea was to create a sense of warmth, passion, or submission. A medieval version of, "He'll like me if I spike the mead." The church strictly forbade this. Love potions were seen as a gateway to sorcery and sin. Inquisitors often listed love charms in their accusations against witches. But still, they persisted, especially among those who felt they had no other chance. Fertility charms, more business than romance. In many cases, marriage wasn't about love, it was about children. And if a woman couldn't conceive, she risked abandonment or replacement. So fertility charms were common. Small trinkets, herbs, and prayers worn or performed in hopes of a pregnancy. Examples include sleeping with a carved wooden phallus under the bed, drinking wine infused with crushed eggshells and mint, walking around a church 3 times on Midsummer's Eve, barefoot while chanting, "Mother of God, gift of seed." These charms were sometimes blessed by priests, other times condemned by them. Folk religion often blurred the lines between Christian ritual and ancient pagan fertility rites. One charm recorded in a 15th century French text advised women to place thy husband's shirt, unwashed, upon the altar of Saint Anne, and strike it with a willow switch 7 times before sunrise. The text is unclear whether this was about fertility or revenge. Newlyweds were often scrutinized, not just by family, but by the community. Bedding rituals sometimes included symbolic acts, breaking bread together, drinking honeyed milk, or tying knots in the sheets to bind their spirits. And omens were everywhere. If the bride's candle blew out on the wedding night, barren marriage. If a dog howled during consummation, bad luck for the firstborn. If the bed creaked 3 times, a prosperous union, seriously. One particularly odd belief. If a hedgehog ran across threshold of your home during the first month of marriage, it foretold infidelity. No one knows why. But hedgehogs were feared and respected, seen as omens of disruption and unexpected desire. Some turned to dreams, not just as symbols, but as instruction manuals. There are records of people sleeping with herbs under their pillows, hoping to receive divine or prophetic guidance about whom to marry. In some German towns, it was believed that if you dreamt of someone 3 nights in a row, they were destined for you, or to destroy your crops. Meanwhile, the wealthier classes turned to astrologers. Court records show that nobles, especially women, frequently consulted horoscopes before agreeing to marriage contracts. Astrological compatibility was assessed based on birth charts. If Mars was rising in Leo and Venus was hidden in Scorpio, the marriage might be delayed or canceled. Finally, there were spoken spells, words repeated quietly to gain someone's affection or loyalty. One documented in an old Breton manuscript reads, "By bread and bone, by moon and flame, let their heart beat at my name." These charms were repeated while facing west, often at dusk, and always in secret. They weren't shouted. They were whispered into the wind, into the walls, into the folds of a cloak. Did they work? No one can say. But in a world where options were limited, and where love was more risk than reward, people clung to the tiniest hope. The flicker of belief that maybe, just maybe, they could bend fate with a flower, a phrase, or a hedgehog. All of this, the potions, the prayers, the charms, served one purpose: to gain a tiny measure of control in a world ruled by others. Because love in the Middle Ages wasn't free. It was filtered through class, family, land, reputation, and religion. And so, if a girl lit 3 candles and prayed to the moon, or a boy carved a knot under his bedpost hoping to win someone's favor, it wasn't foolish. It was human. Just like now. In a world before electricity, before Google, before swipes and likes, love was slower, heavier, and far more dangerous. In medieval times, marriage wasn't about candlelit dinners or longing glances across a crowded room. It was about survival, status, and soil. Love, if it came at all, was often a latecomer to a union born of contracts and cows. In many villages, a boy's romantic prospects depended less on his heart and more on his harvest. A girl's future was determined not by her feelings, but by her family's fortune, or lack of it. If a man had land, livestock, or tools, he was a candidate. If he could plow a field and build a fence, he could marry. If not, he was just another bachelor, another pair of hands working someone else's soil. Women, meanwhile, were often traded like fields, exchanged for dowries that might include blankets, barrels of grain, or even a good goat. In some communities, marriage resembled a business merger more than a love story. Parents negotiated, priests observed. The bride and groom simply complied. But not always. There were stories, quiet, half-buried, of defiance. A girl running to a convent the night before her wedding. A boy refusing the girl his father chose for him. These moments rarely ended in fairy tales. They often ended in isolation, in shame, in exile. Because to rebel against a marriage arrangement was to rebel against the very structure of medieval life. And yet, love endured. In some marriages, feelings grew over time. In shared work, shared silence, shared grief. A woman might come to respect the man she once feared. A man might come to cherish the woman he barely noticed. These were quiet loves, uncelebrated but steady. Others remained cold, functional, husband and wife as co-laborers, not companions. But not all love was permitted. Some was dangerous. To love across class lines was an invitation to ruin. A peasant girl who caught the eye of a nobleman might be flattered, until she realized she would never be his equal. If he wanted her, he'd take her. If she resisted, she'd be blamed. If she hoped, she'd be mocked. And if love bloomed between a priest and a parishioner, or between two people of the same sex, or between a widow and a monk, punishment followed. Excommunication, banishment, whispers that clung for generations. Because the medieval world feared what it could not contain, it enforced love's boundaries with the same tools it used to shape its fields, harsh, blunt, and unyielding. Still, love found ways. Through secret glances during Mass, through hands that brushed when passing a jug of water, through poems carved into beams, hidden beneath haylofts, through songs sung in dialects that only two people understood. Some turned to magic. A girl desperate for affection might seek out an old woman in the woods, offering coin or bread in exchange for a charm or potion. A love spell, brewed from herbs, petals, or things best not named. She might slip it into wine, whisper her desire into the steam of a boiling kettle, light 3 candles, and pray to a saint with a forgotten name. Others turned to omens, apple peels thrown over shoulders, names written in soot, dreams interpreted by midwives who claimed to hear the voices of fate. A sneeze at sunrise could signal courtship. A hedgehog on the doorstep could foretell betrayal. Not all believed, but many hoped. Matchmaking, too, was its own kind of magic. Often handled by elderly women, wise from years of watching lives unravel, they matched more than fortunes. They matched temperaments, work ethic, the shape of a chin, whether someone laughed too loudly at a funeral. Their advice was trusted more than priests, more than parents, because they knew what the others didn't. Who truly fit with whom? Who would grow together in hardship, and who would tear apart in silence? Sometimes they were right, sometimes not. When families agreed to a match, the couple rarely met alone. They spoke under supervision, exchanged gifts in public, whispered in the shadows of the chapel. Then came the wedding, a communal event, sanctioned by church and community, witnessed by those who would watch the marriage unfold year after year. But even within marriage, not all was well. If a woman committed adultery, she faced public shame, a shaved head, a walk of punishment through the village, a whipping post. For men, punishment varied, harsh for those who overstepped, ignored for those with power. Because inheritance mattered more than justice. A child born of doubt was a threat to property, to bloodlines. Some lovers defied it all. A young man who carved his love's initials into the church gate. A noble lady who took her squire as a lover and paid the price with her freedom. A knight who fell for his lord's daughter and was never seen again. These stories rarely ended well, but they burned brighter for their brevity. In cities, love took new forms. Courting benches in marketplaces, spring festivals with kidnappings that were part game, part courtship ritual. Elaborate matchmaking led by guilds or religious communities. Even astrological consultations, where nobles refused marriage unless the stars aligned. Still, the truest rituals were the smallest ones. A shared loaf of bread, a song hummed during weaving, a token hidden in a chutu, a name spoken once in the dark, then never again. Even in a world that feared love, people still reached for it. They fell, quietly and dangerously. They loved, with rules and despite them. They married sometimes for gain, sometimes for peace, sometimes, rarely, for joy. Because even in the darkest corners of history, love refused to be extinguished. It bent, it hid, it waited, but it never truly disappeared. Would you like me to continue the narrative from here? There are still many themes we can explore next. The rise of courtly love, noble romances, romantic betrayal in royal courts, or how love and death intertwined during plague times. Just say, "Continue," and I'll pick up the thread. It began with a glance, not from across a market square or between hay bales, but from a castle balcony where silk fluttered like flags of temptation. The noblewoman stood still, her gaze falling upon the knight below, armor gleaming, eyes dark with duty. He bowed, she turned, and the game began. Among the nobility, love wore a different mask, not survival, but spectacle. It wasn't meant to be practical. It was meant to be poetic. This was the world of courtly love, of verses whispered into handkerchiefs, of duels fought not for war, but for the favor of a lady. It was a love divorced from marriage, often chaste, always dramatic. A knight might serve a woman for years, asking for nothing but a glance, a token, a single syllable of her praise. The lady, married to a lord twice her age, might reward him with a nod, or a ring, or rarely a kiss, stolen in the shadows behind the chapel after a feast. It was love as performance, love as religion. Courtly love didn't require consummation. In fact, it often forbade it. The suffering was the point. A true lover, they believed, longed without fulfillment. He burned gloriously and was better for it. And the lady, she was muse, judge, prize, and tormentor all at once. The troubadours, those wandering poets of southern France, wrote endlessly of such love. They told of ladies whose beauty blinded, whose refusals were sweeter than kisses. They sang of knights who wept into the dirt, who rode into battle with a silk scarf tied beneath their armor. These songs weren't just entertainment. They were lessons. They taught lords and ladies how to feel. But the danger of courtly love was not in the verses. It was in believing them. Because sometimes, the knight and the lady forgot the rules. They let words become touches. Touches became promises. Promises became scandal. And scandal, in a royal court, was a weapon. Take the story of Eleanor of Aquitaine, Queen of France, then England. She surrounded herself with poets and lovers, men who praised her in song and stirred her court into a frenzy of devotion. She encouraged her daughters to demand respect, even love, in marriage. Radical, dangerous, beautiful. But beauty fades when power trembles. Her husband, King Henry II, grew jealous, not of a single man, but of the freedom she represented. He imprisoned her for years, not for adultery, not for treason, for being beloved in a way he could not control. In lesser courts, the punishments were more immediate. A lady caught in a secret affair might be locked in a tower, her lover hanged. A poem found beneath a pillow could condemn two people to ruin. And yet, still, they loved. Still, they risked it. Because courtly love offered something no marriage contract could: choice. Even if it was imaginary, even if it was fleeting, it was intoxicating. For the first time in history, people weren't just speaking of love. They were dreaming it, idealizing it, worshiping it. The idea that love should hurt, that longing made you noble, that devotion could transcend flesh. These were new, and they echoed through the halls of castles and into the centuries beyond. Yet courtly love belonged to the privileged, to the silk-clad, the literate, the idle. In the villages, where calloused hands needed bread and eyes squinted at dusk for lost sheep, love was still a burden, still a bargain. There, No one sang your virtues. No one carved your name into lute wood. You found love in the fields, if you were lucky. And if you weren't, you simply endured. But in the courts, love was theater. Every look a line, every sigh a verse. It was a game, a war, a poem. And sometimes it was real. Even there, for love, when denied or twisted, became weapon. Among nobles, betrayal often started as flirtation, a glance too long at a feast, a private letter intercepted, a husband too busy with war, a wife too lonely behind stone walls. They said the troubadours taught people how to love, but they also taught them how to stray. A knight once pledged to a lady might come to desire another. And a lady, married not for passion but for politics, might find solace in a squire's smile or a servant's song. When discovered, retribution was swift. A nobleman who uncovered his wife's infidelity might have her lover executed, hung from the castle gate or thrown to the wolves of the court. A wife had fewer weapons, but some learned to wield poison in sweetened wine or arrange hunting accidents on misty mornings. There's the tale of Lady Roswin of Devon, whose husband returned early from campaign and found her chambers locked. The squire within leapt from the window and broke both legs. She claimed surprise. Her husband claimed vengeance. The squire's legs were the least of his losses. Among common folk, revenge was less poetic and more practical. A scorned woman might ruin her rival's name at market, spread whispers through spinning circles, curse a man's bread oven so nothing would rise. A betrayed man might take his wife's dowry and vanish, or worse, beat her or bring her before the church court for adultery. One such case survives from 1296 in York. A miller accused his wife of laying with a baker's apprentice. She denied it. The baker vanished. The church sentenced her to public repentance, barefoot and in linen, walking the nave of the cathedral as townsfolk watched. Her husband remarried the following year. She lived another decade, silent and childless. Some took betrayal and turned it inward. They left, disappeared into forests, into pilgrimages, into convents and monasteries where no one asked too many questions. Love had failed them, so they gave themselves to God or shadow. But sometimes, rarely, revenge wore elegance. A woman wronged might write a ballad. She might pen verses under a false name, mocking the man who abandoned her. These songs spread faster than ink, sung in taverns and behind laundry lines. One such song, The Weaver's Curse, was so biting it was banned from 3 cathedrals. It told of a man who promised love and left with a richer bride. In the song, the betrayed woman sits at her loom and weaves spiders into his wedding cloth. On his wedding night, he is found breathless, tangled in silk. Not all betrayal ended in death. Most ended in distance. A cold bed, a longer walk home, a silence too deep to break. But betrayal shaped hearts. It hardened some, unmade others. It created widows of the living, or lovers who only loved in memory. Some became stories, warnings, some became ghosts. Because in the medieval world, betrayal wasn't just personal. It was political, familial, sacred. To betray love was to betray order, and to seek vengeance was to challenge fate itself. Yet still they did. Because in a world where love was rare, where choices were few, where feelings were shackled by duty, betrayal, however cruel, proved something had once been real, even if it broke everything after. Shall I keep going? Next, we could follow love through the Black Death and wartime, when even in the shadow of death, hearts still yearned. Say Tiep Tuk, or continue, and I'll guide us into that storm. Then let us walk forward, into ash, into silence, into a world where the air itself turned against you. And yet, somehow, love did not die. It began with coughs, with rats, with a shadow moving too quickly through the alleys of London and the markets of Florence. The year was 1347, and with it came the plague. Within a few months, entire villages were gone. Fields lay unharvested, church bells rang without stopping, and the very idea of tomorrow began to unravel. No one was untouched, not king, not monk, not beggar. And yet, in that darkness, love did not vanish. It changed. Where once there was time to woo, to wait, to write long verses in hope, now there was only urgency. The betrothal period that once lasted months became weeks, then days. People married quickly, sometimes strangers to one another, desperate for companionship in a world that seemed to be burning from the inside. They didn't marry for dowries or land. Not anymore. They married for hands to hold, for breath to feel near them, for eyes to meet when sleep wouldn't come. In cities where half the population was dead or dying, widows and widowers remarried with shocking speed. Some out of survival, 2 incomes, 2 bodies to share labor. Others out of longing, not for new beginnings, but for a quiet echo of what had been lost. Priests, overwhelmed, shortened ceremonies. Where once there had been music, feast, and benediction, now there was a whispered vow, a nod, and a hurried blessing before the next funeral. But love, raw, panicked, fragile, was everywhere. A washerwoman who had buried her child might find herself weeping into the arms of the baker who had just lost his wife. Neither planned to fall, neither believed they could. But sorrow opened doors that propriety had once bolted shut. Letters written during plague years carry a different tone than those before. There are fewer metaphors, fewer flourishes. They are blunt. Director: I do not know if I will see the sun next week. If I do, I want you to be beside me. That is not poetry. That is truth. Even lust changed. With death at the door, some people turned reckless, abandoning the church's rules, taking lovers openly, refusing to wait. Others did the opposite, retreating into celibacy, into prayer, convinced that any passion would invite judgment. There are records of entire convents locking themselves away, not to avoid the plague, but to avoid desire. But most simply adapted. Couples carved messages into trees because paper was scarce. Rings were made from bone. A bridal veil might be a borrowed shawl. They loved with less, but they loved harder. And when one of them fell ill, because always someone did, they stayed, often knowing what it meant. A man would sit beside his wife's bed, cooling her forehead with a rag soaked in vinegar, knowing she would not rise. A woman would hold her fiancé's hand as he coughed blood, whispering promises to marry him in the next life, if not this one. And when they died, as so many did, they were often buried in mass graves, nameless, faceless, forgotten by history, but not forgotten by each other. Some left small signs, a ribbon tucked into the corpse's sleeve, a carved symbol on the burial shroud, a stone laid a certain way atop the earth, not to mark love for others, but so that if some god still watched, he would know this body had been loved, because that mattered. It still matters. Even now when we remember plague years, we speak of death, of numbers, of silence. But behind every statistic was a lover who said goodbye too early, a bride who never wore the dress, a child born to a woman who had no one left to name him. We forget them, but they didn't forget each other, and that is the miracle. In the face of rot, fear, and fire, people still reached for each other, still whispered stay, still risked everything to be held, to be known. to be loved. And some, somehow, survived. Let me know when you're ready to continue. Next, we'll explore the secret codes of love, the letters, the gestures, the languages of longing in a world that watched your every move. Say continue or tiep tuk, and I'll take you there. Then follow me, not into battle or plague this time, but into candlelight, into quiet corners of monasteries and manor halls, into the fragile spaces where love was written, not spoken, hidden, not shouted, where even silence could be loud. Because in a world where open affection was dangerous, love had to become language, secret language. A glance could mean longing. A touch of the sleeve could say everything a mouth dared not. Lovers created their own systems, delicate, complex, and easily missed by anyone who wasn't watching closely. They had to. Let's begin with letters. In the 13th and 14th centuries, when few people could read, letter writing was a radical act. To write to someone meant you trusted them, needed them, or longed for them. To write of love? That was risk. And so, the words were coded. A common greeting, "I trust this letter finds you in health and joy," could mean, "I miss you." "I send my respect to your family," might really mean, "I think of you every hour." But sometimes, the letters said exactly what they meant, simply veiled in metaphor. One preserved from 1392, sent by a clerk to a woman in Ghent. "I am the candle, and you the match. And though I burn for you, I cannot ask to be lit. Yet still I hope." They never married. But the letters survived, bound into the back of a prayer book, hidden between pages about forgiveness and saints. In monasteries, where vows of celibacy held tight as rope, monks and nuns who felt something more than piety often found ways to speak without being heard. They used marginalia, tiny notes or images scribbled in the margins of sacred texts. One manuscript from a French abbey shows, barely visible in the corner, a rabbit handing another rabbit a heart-shaped root. It meant nothing to the prior, but to the scribe and the sister who copied it, it meant everything. Sometimes lovers didn't write at all. They used objects: a sprig of rosemary left on a windowsill, a ribbon dropped in the churchyard, tied in a specific knot, a pastry with 2 cherries, not one, left wrapped in cloth. These were not gifts. They were messages. "I am here. I am thinking of you. Tonight at dusk." In larger towns, some hired scribes to write for them. Illiterate women would speak their feelings aloud to an old man with ink-stained fingers who would write them down in flowery Latin or clumsy French. These letters were carried by servants, by traveling friars, sometimes hidden inside hollowed-out loaves of bread. In one case, a noblewoman in Lyon had letters smuggled between castle towers via falcon. The birds were trained to fly between her window and her lover's on the far side of the river. They wrote only in riddles. If the bird arrived wearing a black ribbon, no meeting. Red, come. Blue, danger. But not all secret messages were so elegant. Some were scratched into wood under shared pews. Some were whispered during confession, disguised as sins of thought, not action. Some were sung, love songs disguised as hymns, slipping beneath the notice of stern priests. And yes, there were those who dared write everything, who poured out their hearts with no filter, no code, only truth. One letter from a merchant's daughter in Bruges. "I know we shall not marry. You have land, and I have none. But I would rather have an evening beneath the trees with you than 10 years beside a man who counts coins while I cry." She never signed her name. The letter was found, centuries later, stuffed into the lining of a traveling cloak buried in a church crypt. These are the ghosts of romance. Letters never sent, glances never returned, songs sung once and then swallowed forever. But they mattered. Because when society says you cannot love, the act of loving becomes rebellion. And rebellion, when done in ink, survives longer than steel. When you're ready, I'll take you deeper, into marriages themselves. Not their beginnings, but their middles. The loyalty, the silence, the late blooming of love, or the quiet rot of regret. Say continue, and I'll begin again. Then step with me now, not into the fire of first love, but into the long, uncertain years that follow. Past the ceremonies, past the feasts, past the whispers and the lace, into the quiet rooms of married life, where love either deepened like roots or cracked like old timber. Because marriage in the medieval world was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of 1,000 days of compromise. For most, marriage was arranged. The bride and groom might have spoken once, maybe not at all. The bride was often in her teens, the groom older, sometimes twice her age. There were witnesses, blessings, and ink on parchment. But no one asked if they were ready. No one asked if they wanted each other. They were simply joined and expected to build something that lasted. And sometimes, it did. Some couples grew into each other like stones in a river. She learned his silences, he learned her rhythms. They planted together, bled together, held each other through winters that killed neighbors. Not every love story begins with lightning. Some begin with habit, and habit becomes affection. A woman might not have chosen her husband, but after bearing his children and tending his wounds, something shifted. She saw the tremble in his hands when their eldest was feverish. He saw the way she stayed awake during storms, praying without words. Love born not of desire, but of shared survival. But others? Others never found that warmth. There were marriages where words turned sharp as blades, where the home became a battlefield of looks and silences. A man might drink too much. A woman might retreat into spinning or prayer, her eyes hollow from trying too hard for too long. In these houses, love was not dead, it was absent. A ghost that never moved in. Yet they stayed together, because divorce was rare, nearly impossible for commoners, and deeply scandalous for nobles. Some women escaped through the church. If their husbands died, they chose not to remarry, instead entering convents or pledging widowhood, vowing never to be owned again. Others stayed married but lived separate lives, he on one side of the field, she on the other, speaking only when required. And yet, even among broken matches, there were flickers. A sick husband reaching out for the wife he once ignored. A woman, beaten by age and sorrow, weeping over her husband's body, not because she loved him, but because she had spent her whole life trying to. And sometimes, quietly, surprisingly, love arrived late. Two people, weathered by grief and duty, who found one another again after their children were grown. They began to talk in ways they hadn't in decades. They laughed again, shared stories, remembered the one time he brought her a flower, the one night she sang to him when he was ill. Tiny, golden moments, enough to light the dark. There's a letter found in the floorboards of a manor in Yorkshire, dated 1441, written by a husband to his wife of 23 years. I never knew your favorite song until last week. I asked your sister. I've sung it every night since. It is a small thing, but I give it to you now, as I should have long ago. It was never sent. Perhaps it was too late. Perhaps he died before he could hand it to her. But it was there, in his hand, in his words, in his wanting. Medieval marriage was not romantic, but it wasn't loveless either. It was messy, raw, sometimes cruel, sometimes beautiful. It was cooking beside each other in silence. It was arguing over coins. It was holding one another as the snow piled outside, knowing the goat might not make it through the night. It was forgiveness, asked or never given. It was staying. And sometimes it was choosing to love, even when you didn't have to. Shall we continue? Next, I'll show you how love tangled with faith, how religion ruled hearts, forbade touch, and yet, paradoxically, became the very space where passion hid. Say continue when you're ready. Then let us walk together now into the chapel's cold light, into incense and Latin, into the fold of hands and the quiet hush of stone, into the tension between body and soul. Because in the medieval world, love did not only answer to the heart, it answered to God. The church stood everywhere, in the bells that rang through villages, in the crosses above marriage beds, in the prayers murmured during birth, harvest, death. Love, too, was not immune. It had to kneel. For centuries, the church shaped how people loved, not just whom they could love, but how they were allowed to feel it. Desire was dangerous. It wasn't just frowned upon. It was sinful. A fire that could burn down a soul. A temptation sent by the devil himself. Passion was meant only for procreation, never for pleasure. Even within marriage, lust was suspect. A husband who loved his wife too much, who touched her too often, could be accused of weakness. A woman who sought her husband's affection might be called immodest. Confession became a battlefield of intimacy. Priests heard everything. A woman might kneel and whisper, "I think of my husband when he's gone and wish he would return to me." A man might admit to waking in the night, dreaming not of sin, but simply of warmth. These confessions were not met with comfort. They were met with penance. 3 Hail Marys for imagining her smile. 1 week without meat for the longing that stirred as he watched her bake. A pilgrimage if you dared touch her without intent to make a child. Love, the church taught, must serve God or be punished. And so it retreated. People learned to hide their affection, even in marriage. They kissed in the dark. They whispered tenderness only at the edge of sleep. They made love not from joy, but duty, praying that pleasure would be brief and easily forgotten. And yet, the church also told another story, one of divine love, of sacred longing. Mystics, men and women who claimed to speak with God, wrote of ecstasy, of union, of an overwhelming desire to be one with the divine. Their language was not cold. It was passionate, erotic even. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux wrote of the soul's yearning for Christ as a bride yearning for her groom. Hildegard of Bingen saw visions where God pierced the heart with light, flooding it with trembling warmth. Julian of Norwich described Jesus as a mother, drawing the soul to his breast, nurturing it with tenderness. These were not distant, intellectual loves. They were fierce, intimate, and in them, people began to glimpse something radical. Maybe longing itself wasn't the sin. Maybe it was sacred. Maybe it pointed towards something higher. And so lovers, too, borrowed this language. A man might write to his beloved, "You are my vision." When I kneel, it is your name, I whisper. A woman might pray not just to Mary, but through her, speaking her sorrow as if it were her own. In monasteries, monks wrote of each other with language that straddled devotion and desire. In convents, Nuns wrote poetry to the Virgin that read like love letters. Some found in God the only space where they could express what society forbade. There's a note from a novice monk in Italy, 1473. I tell myself I love only your spirit. But when you pass, I feel it in my throat. May God forgive me if I lie. He never left the order, but he kept writing in secret to the same brother for 12 years. The letters were found buried beneath the floorboards of the scriptorium, wrapped in linen and sealed with wax. The church ruled love with fear, but it also, unintentionally, gave it form. Taught people how to yearn, how to ache, how to imagine a love beyond rules. Because even as priests warned against passion, the stained glass above them showed it. Saints pierced with arrows, martyrs cradling one another, angels gazing at the divine with eyes full of fire. Perhaps some thought the line between divine and human love was thinner than anyone dared admit. And so they loved, quietly, carefully, sometimes guiltily, but always, fully. Let me know when you're ready to continue. Next, I can guide you through the great myths and legends, where medieval love became immortal. In Arthur, in Isolde, in the songs of doomed lovers whose names outlived their sorrow. Just say continue, then come now not through cloisters or kitchens, but through fog-draped forests, across moors haunted by memory, into the flickering torchlight of story. Because some loves in the medieval world were too large to live in flesh, they had to be carved into legend, into parchment and poem, into the trembling voices of minstrels around firelight. They became myth, and by becoming myth, they became eternal. First, Arthur, king of Camelot, bearer of Excalibur, crowned by fate. His legend was not just a tale of swords and thrones. It was a triangle of love, deep, painful, and doomed. Arthur married Guinevere, a queen of unmatched grace and intelligence. But she loved Lancelot, Arthur's bravest knight, and he loved her in return. Their love was not base. It was not lustful in the way the church warned against. It was reverent, tragic, torn between honor and longing. Lancelot fought for Arthur, bled for him, swore loyalty to him, and still his heart beat for Guinevere. She caught between two forms of love, duty and desire, withered beneath the weight of both. Their affair, when discovered, shattered the Round Table. Brother turned on brother. Kingdoms fell. And Arthur, betrayed not only by his wife, but by the man he loved like a brother, rode to war and ruin. That is the story. But beneath the chivalry, beneath the battles and betrayals, lies something simpler. Three people who loved each other. And because the world gave them no way to do so without breaking everything, they broke. Then there was Tristan and Isolde. He, a warrior. She, a princess promised to another. Their love was kindled by accident or fate, when they drank a potion meant for someone else. From that moment, they belonged to each other, body and soul. But she was married to his king. And so their love became a thing of shadows, glances across feast tables, secret meetings in candlelit chapels. In some versions, they fled together. In others, they were caught and punished. Always they died, apart or together, depending on the telling. But always they died loving. And always the story lingered. It was not just nobles who knew these tales. Even peasants could recite them, piece by piece, passed down by grandmothers and wandering singers. They were not just entertainment. They were mirrors, because the world was full of forbidden loves, of promises made too young, of desire punished by law. The legends gave shape to suffering, gave it beauty. They whispered, "You are not alone in your longing." Others have felt this ache. Even kings and queens, even knights with swords of steel and hearts of gold. There were other tales, too. Of Floris and Blanchefleur, lovers separated by religion and rank, who reunited through cleverness and faith. Of Abelard and Heloise, real people, not myth. He a teacher, she his brilliant pupil. Their letters are still read, still burn with intensity. They loved in secret, had a child, were torn apart. He was castrated. She became a nun. And yet they kept writing to each other across years, across ruins. He once wrote, "God knows, I never sought anything in you but yourself." And she, "I would rather be yours, even in shame, than his in honor." These stories endure not because they were perfect, but because they weren't. They told the truth, that love is rarely clean, that it wounds, that it defies rules, that it sometimes costs everything. But also that it is worth remembering, worth mourning, worth telling again. Even now, we hear echoes of them, in novels, in films, in whispered regrets and half-smiled memories. We live in their shadow, and maybe, secretly, we want what they had. A love so fierce it could not be forgotten, even if it destroyed us. That's what medieval legends gave us. Not models, but warnings and gifts. When you're ready, I'll bring us to the final truths. How those old ideas linger even now. How we are still haunted by their rules, inspired by their dreams, shaped by their scars. Say continue, and I'll take you into the present, where their shadows still fall. Then let us return, slowly, gently, from castles and cloisters, from forests thick with legend, back to the present day. Back to where you sit now, screen glowing, centuries away from nights and veils and silent glances. And yet, not so far. Because the truth is, medieval love never really died. It became us. Look at the world around you. We think ourselves modern, free, unbound. We swipe left and right, write love songs, watch grand romances on screen. But the bones of those old stories still shape our hearts. They echo in our choices, our hesitations, our hopes. Why still do we believe that love should hurt? Why do we romanticize longing? Why do we believe that the deepest love is the one we cannot have? Because the medieval world taught us that real love must suffer, that it must be fought for, denied, forbidden. It told us that to truly love was to wait, to ache, to bleed. That joy was too easy. That pain meant depth. Lancelot and Guinevere, Tristan and Isolde, Heloise and Abelard. We still chase that fire, even when we don't know why. Even now, we believe love is nobler when it's patient. That grand gestures matter more than daily kindness. That sacrifice is proof. We inherit their myths. We still hide feelings in coded messages, texting ellipses instead of saying what we mean. We still wait for someone else to make the first move, fearing sin or shame, though no priest watches us now. We call it the friend zone. But it's just another courtly agony, rebranded. The knight who waits too long, the lady who cannot choose. We ghost, we yearn, we burn in silence. And in marriage, we still carry their ghosts. We want our spouse to be a partner, a lover, a soulmate, a rescuer. We expect love to last without tending. And when it doesn't, we wonder why it fades. But in truth, love never faded. Only the story changed. We have more freedom now, more voice, more space to love who we choose, how we choose. But the stories buried in our collective hearts still whisper the old rules. And sometimes, that's not a curse. Sometimes, remembering what they felt gives us courage. The farmer's wife who stayed and chose to love. The widower who remarried not for land, but for laughter. The lovers who risked ruin to meet once in a shadowed field. They remind us that love has always been a defiant act, that it has never been clean, that it has always been worth it. So what was love like in medieval times? It was brutal, beautiful, silent, screamed. It was hidden beneath veils and carved into stone. It was punished. It was worshipped. It was a risk every time. And isn't it still? Even now, in the most modern moment, to love is to hope against uncertainty, to offer something fragile in a world that does not guarantee gentleness. But they did it anyway. Every century, every village, every dusty chapel and wind-beaten tower. And so do we. Because love, true love, has never belonged to just one age. It is not medieval. It is not modern. It is timeless. And it is always worth remembering.